This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 348, A Website's Carbon Footprint. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about a website's carbon footprint with Jerry McGovern. Jerry has published 8 books. His latest, Worldwide Waste, examines the impact digital is having on the environment. He developed Top Tasks, a research method which helped identify what truly matters to people. Jerry, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for inviting me on.
I'm Nick Laughlin, and today my co-hosts are John Picozzi.
Hello, internet friends.
And joining us for the next 4 weeks as our guest host is Mike Herschel. Mike is a front-end dev at AVB Digital, which works with large federal websites. Mike is also the lead developer for the Olivero theme, which is now, well, in June, going to become the default theme for Drupal core. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Hey, welcome, or hello, internet friends.
I have to say, I've been using Olivero on my personal site. I rebuilt it a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And it's using Tome and some front end web components and things, but the base is using Olivero, and I it's clean. It's clean and fast. I'm pretty happy with it.
I appreciate it. I hope it has a low carbon footprint.
Yeah.
So the module of the week this week is config pages. What can you tell us about config pages, Mike?
Yeah, so I was made aware of config pages when doing the Florida Drupal Camp website. And so, you know how like you go into Drupal core and you have like some fields like, let's say like the site name, the site slogan, and site logo and stuff like that. What if you could attach like fields onto that? Like what if you could like define your own field and say, I want to have like a start date, because I'm running an event website, or this config pages kind of allows you to do that. It allows you to define what's called like a config page, and that'll live in like the root of your admin menu, and it's kind of like an entity, and you add fields onto that. So like for the Florida Drupal Camp website, like we have like what we say like front page text, start date, end date, registration link, and then all throughout the site, like when I need to like reference the registration link, I can just reference this one value. So if I update the registration link, it updates everywhere, and it integrates in with the token module. So you can, like if you're using it in your content, you can do that. And it's just, it's honestly pretty slick, and the UI is pretty nice, and it does everything that you'd hope it would do.
Yeah, I'm actually using it right now on a project, and this is kind of my first use of it. And it's pretty great as far as like, especially if you're doing custom work or you have custom modules that need to pull in certain configurations. You can set up a config page and then use those values as the inputs for that module. So works pretty well.
So moving on to our primary topic this week. So with Earth Day being April 22nd this year, we are releasing this just in time to be 1 month and 1 day past that. So
there's a note here in the show notes that says, I messed up the date, but Nick's being nice and not bringing it up. Yeah, I thought it was May 22nd. I'm sorry, folks. So this is our Earth Day show.
I mean, my opinion is it's one of those things where Earth Day becomes this big thing. People pay attention to it, raises some awareness, but it's also one of those things where the rest of the year people don't necessarily think about it. So I think it's kind of interesting to talk about this topic a little bit after, because it's not important just in April or in Earth Day or the week leading up to it. This is important for everybody.
Your website will still have a carbon footprint in November or December.
Yeah. So speaking of which, let's start with the easy question, Jerry. What is a carbon footprint?
Well, a carbon footprint is basically your carbon impact on the world. How you're living, what you're doing, what you're interacting with, how much CO2. Some people might or might not know that actually just breeding has a carbon impact. That we can be responsible for, in a 24-hour period, somewhere in the region of 1 kg of CO2 just breeding. And if we're doing a lot of heavy exercise or whatever, we're going to be emitting more carbon if we're asleep. So just being alive, we're having some impact. But then if you're driving or getting a plane or doing interacting using things, whether they have two types of carbon. There's what might be described as embedded carbon or embedded energy, and then there's use carbon or use energy. And the embedded is all the carbon that was required to make that thing that you're actually using. And then there's the use energy, the carbon or the energy that's created as you use the actual device.
Interesting. And I guess my first question when you look at something like that is it easy to find that kind of information? So for example, one of those things that I always think about is like plastic bags versus paper bags, right? And people generally think that paper bags are more environmentally good because they can biodegrade and they can be recycled easier and things like that. But a question is that I've always had is, does it take more energy to create the paper bag than the plastic bag? Maybe not. I'm not saying it does, but how do you find out?
No, it's a good question, and it's a while since I checked that, but I actually believe it does. And say a cotton bag or a leather bag would be an order of magnitude times more than, maybe 100 times, 150 times more than a plastic bag. So the key thing there would be to use the thing at least 200 times. Like the problem with plastic, and it's the problem with electronics as well, is that it has a never-ending story when it finishes. It has a very short life, but it lives forever as a vampire. Plastic never goes away, it just gets smaller. So the problem that we have with plastics now is microplastics, that we're literally breeding them or ingesting. They're in all animals and they're building up at a significant concentration every year. So it's hard enough to quantify the manufacturing and the use, but it's even harder to quantify often the long-term effects of something that will never go away. So plastic will never go away. So there's a kind of three calculations that you have to deal with. It's the making of the thing, the using of the thing, and then its circular economy capacity or its recyclability. Like really, you can't recycle plastic. There's a few types of plastics you can recycle, but you can't recycle them endlessly. So when you recycle them once, they degrade. So like glass, you can always glass will always maintain its the same purity no matter how many times you recycle it. When you recycle plastic 4 or 5 times, it gets to a level that you can't really recycle it and use it as a product anymore. So there are issues when you're calculating that are 3 components: the making the thing, the using the thing, and what happens after it, so-called its end of life.
Interesting. And are there good resources? Are there good resources for finding out like a particular product's level of impact if you're interested in that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk now, about the circular economy, which the idea is that it's not net zero, it's zero waste. So how can we create a model where there is in essence no waste? Everything becomes somehow reusable or somehow a component, which is a kind of, to some degree, what the electronics industry was like 40 years ago. The electronics industry has become, used to be relatively circular, at least to some degree, a lot more. So if you look up circular economy you'll find a lot of stuff about the concepts behind and looking at the journeys. The recycling, I know we're going to get into electronics at the moment, but recycling in electronics is really, really poor now. It's less than 20% for electronics is actually recycled. And of the 20% that's recycled, you will typically only be able to reclaim about 30 to 40% of the materials. So even the recycling process is so crude because of the way things are designed that it damages as much as it retrieves in its process. So yeah, there's a lot out there, but it's stuck in a lot of different places. But a good place to start would be the circular economy, to go looking for stuff. Ellen MacArthur Foundation was one of the pioneers of circular economy thinking. So that would be a good place to start about these, creating a world that is genuinely sustainable.
So let's refocus now that we have a really good idea of like carbon footprint and kind of the life cycle of some of these things that we use, right? How does that apply to websites? Like, how does a website create a carbon footprint?
How does website? Yeah, great question, John. And so there's two ways, and the first way, you're not going to really believe it. It's the machines. So the internet is the biggest machine that was ever created, right? So electronics, particularly consumer electronics, maybe not so much high intensity organizational electronic like a server or something like that, tend to have the vast majority of their impact in their manufacturing. So when you buy an iPhone or a Lenovo laptop or whatever, basically 80% of the pollution has occurred. So if you buy a smartphone, about 60 kg of CO2 occurred in its manufacture, right? So across its lifetime, if you keep it for 5 years, maybe about another 20 kg. So the way websites, they often in a way indirectly affect is that because the web is getting bigger with everything else getting bigger, they often force people, and there's a whole range of pressures forcing people to upgrade their phones. But I've heard people say, no, I had to change my phone because I can't access my bank anymore because they're now using, so it's not necessarily always weight, but it can sometimes be protocols or programming languages that force. So a core rule of sustainability is basically allow people use the oldest devices possible in the environment. To be anywhere close to sustainable, we should be keeping phones for 10 years and laptops for 20 years. And we're only keeping them for about 2 years and about 5 years in the process. So anything we can do from a website point of view that allows older equipment to work is a good thing for the world, because if most of the energy and the waste occurs during the manufacturing process, then anything that can contribute to making something live longer is doing a good thing. So 80% of your benefit would be on my website. It works with modern browsers, but it also works with old browsers. It also, and I know there's conflicts between backward compatibility. That's not an easy thing to solve in many ways. But it's actually, if you want to understand digital, you understand the impact of digital, you understand the devices. So the devices are where most of the damage actually occurs in the process.
I want to call it too that's a great accessibility thing too. Like people, if you're looking to reach the widest audience that you want to, people don't always have the newest technology. Sometimes as developers, it's common to look at it on your phone, which might be the latest and greatest, or your development machine, which can handle 1 gig up and down. But if you're making it accessible to older devices, you're also making it accessible to a wider audience, which is great.
So like the synopsis, right, of your website, right? This thing that you have on your on the internet, right? Like thinking about it now, it seems like the carbon footprint for a website is huge, right? Because like if you think about it from like start to finish, right? Like I build websites. I myself am have a carbon footprint, right? The computer I'm using to build the website has a carbon footprint. The server that I'm testing the website on has a carbon footprint, right? The
interesting.
16 environments I have for my website have a carbon footprint. the internet itself has a carbon footprint, and then the users of that website,
Exactly.
both the person and the devices they're using it on, have a carbon footprint. And then that's multiplied by the fact that like every 3 years or 5 years, you have to get a new computer, or every 2 years you get a new phone. So like when we think of just a website on the internet, like it is not, it's not a small-ish. I mean, I'm sure it's smaller than some other processes or some other things that we use daily, right? But like it's a pretty large carbon footprint from end to end, right?
Absolutely, John. And that we rarely tell that story, or we rarely think about that story. As I said at the beginning, the internet is the biggest machine we've ever made. You know, it has a huge architecture, and electronics are incredibly energy intense. And it's not just a carbon footprint. To make an average phone requires almost 14,000 liters of water.
Wow.
14,000 liters of water. To make a laptop requires 190,000 liters of water.
And is that because of the chemical process, or is it because they're using water for cooling and the cutting of metals?
No, that's a different story, John. A typical data center, an average size data center, will drink about 1 million liters of water a day.
Oh, right. Drinking. Got it. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm using it metaphorically speaking, but it'll use it for cooling, and it use it. So one of the core reasons that a laptop or a smartphone uses so much water is basically the chipset. So chips require a massive amount of water to clean them, because they're layered. Chips and every time they're layered, they have to go through cleaning processes with ultra clean water. In fact, but the problem is, it's not ultra. It has certain chemicals in it, so when it's finished, it's a pollutant. So it's dangerous going back into the environment. Right. So chips themselves have a tremendous intensity in need for water in different reasons. So we have material impact. Like your typical smartphone will have somewhere 60 materials, probably 15 of the 17 rare earths in a smartphone. So there's a lot to make a smartphone. So a smartphone is about 160 grams. And there's about 80 grams of mined material in that. The other are plastics or other material. To get that 80 grams of mined material, you have to dig up 90 kg of soil, rock, material. So there's an incredible impact on the planet just for the size of these things that we created. And we've made 15 billion of them since 2007. 15 billion smartphones.
Wow.
So sustainable.
Yeah,
it's not sustainable, but now it's a kind of I remember somebody saying about, if exponential growth, because this is what we're dealing with data as well. We're dealing with exponential growth. So the best way to understand exponential growth is there's a pond, right? And every day there's an algae on the pond, and every day the algae doubles. You know, how many days, and it takes 30 days for the algae to cover the entire pond. How many days until the algae has covered half the pond?
29 days.
Nick, you're smart. Do math.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. You know, we're suddenly, exponential growth. We suddenly reach these huge, when it looks very little for a while, and then it starts really getting bigger. Like in 1970, we were extracting from the earth 25 to 30 billion tons of material. And by 2020, it was 100 billion tons.
Oh my God.
So in 50 years, like since the 70s, like we have also been responsible for 75% of total carbon. So the modern human is around 300,000 years. Until 1975, we had caused, of all that was attributable to us of CO2, 25%. So between 1975 and today, we've done the other 75%. So as Mike said, we are on a totally unsustainable chart. We need to do something.
So before we move on, I want to circle back to something that you said a little earlier, or implied a little bit earlier. You mentioned that consumer electronics, non-servers, non-specialized equipment, generally 80% of their pollution happens in manufacturing before purchase.
In manufacturing and distribution.
I'm curious what that ratio is then for servers, because I presume that ratio is very different.
Not radically different, probably 46. It depends on the use intensity of the machine, how much they're being used, how intensely they're being used, and the electrical profile, So in different countries, there's a chart between how much CO2 is created per kilowatt hour that's produced. So if you create a kilowatt hour with coal, you're going to create more CO2 than if you created a kilowatt hour with solar. Or that's the argument. So it does depend on the profile of the electricity, but broadly speaking, it's probably somewhere in the region of 50-50, because the problem with in that commercial environment is that they tend to have very short lives. So a lot of these servers in a data center might be used intensely, but they're only being used for 24 months, because for various reasons, data centers tend to cycle through their equipment even more quickly than consumers. So it's roughly around 50-50, I think. So it's 80-20, and probably around 50-20, or maybe 40-60, depending on the intensity of use. But a typical server in a data center could still cause 1 to 2 tons of CO2 to manufacture.
Wow. Yeah, I would imagine the manufacturing is more intense just because higher specs, more chips,
exactly,
things like that.
Exactly.
Wow, that's pretty mind blowing. How because you think about it, when I see the title of the show, look at the show notes. What's a website's carbon footprint? You think, well, it's probably just the cycles of electricity that the server provides. But the truth is, I mean, even in this 15 minutes that we've been talking, it's like John said, the whole team that builds it, their computers, the environmental waste. Now, obviously, this computer primarily is for web development. It's used for other stuff, but it makes you think even about things like we talked about last week, continuous integration and testing for your sites. And, you don't think anything of, triggering extra tests or more runs because it's just time. But the truth is, if you make those more efficient, every little bit helps, I guess.
Absolutely. And one thing connected with Mike, what you were just talking about earlier on. So I've developed these models of taking all these things into account, the machine, how long it's going to last, CO2 manufacture, electrical use. So we did this analysis with this agency in Italy, and we calculated that to design a basic website in Italy, so the Italian electrical profile is a bit different from the US one, but to develop, not the visual framework and the coding. So there's no content in it. So we calculated roughly about 60 kg of CO2 for a small website, for a small, so about 60 kg of CO2. Now, one way you could really save CO2 would be reuse. So if you say, oh, we created these components which we've reused, because the component, if you can, it's like remanufacturing. So one of the best things you could do for the environment when you're next buying a phone is buy a remanufactured or refurbished phone, because a lot of the CO2 has already occurred in the material. It's already been made, so to speak. So one of the great lessons that we could do in developing is reusing code, because anything that takes time, and any time that we're not spending it just mentally, we're spending it with a device. And you might say, oh, but I'd be using that device for something else. But you still, if I buy a car in a company, I've got to depreciate my car over 5 years. I don't pay for it all in year one, and I have some mileage estimations, et cetera. So the sense of us saying, yeah, here's a device, it costs 300 kg. Let me get some sort of I'm going to keep it for 4 years. It's going to live for 4 years. Well, how many kgs of CO2 is that a year? How many days I use it? So you can get rough calculations. And basically, if you say, well, this takes 200 hours to develop, you could come out and say, well, that's roughly such and such kg of CO2. Then if you can then reuse that, because that's the world we want, that's circular economy. If we can reuse the stuff. And the other area, I know I'm jumping around it, but John talked about is the use area. If you've got a heavy traffic website, by far the biggest impact is not your environment, it's the environment of your users. Right. So Firefox did a study 3 or 4 years ago, calculating the whole CO2 impact, and they found that 2% of it was operational. So 2% of it was their developers, their offices, etc., and 98% of it was people using their browser. So if you've got a heavy website, let's say, and it takes people 2 minutes to use it, when it could take 1 minute to use it every day, right? And you've got 100,000 people using it every day, like 100,000 minutes every day on all those devices. That, but it's only 1 minute thing. But all of that stuff really cacks up. So if you've got a really big user base, small changes to your code, which allows it to download faster. But what is even more important is what happens when it's downloaded, that, and this is where user experience comes in, and etc., that people you're not asking 20 questions when you could get away with asking 10 questions. You're constantly trying to reduce the weight, the physical weight of the website, but also the need to use it as well.
So I have a couple questions here. So I'm hearing a lot. Like number one, like what you're saying, kind of almost comes down to some website best practices. Like reusing code. That is something that we all strive to do because it makes us more efficient. It makes our websites cost less from a monetary standpoint. But then if we're spending less hours on it, then that has the benefit of reducing the carbon footprint. Is there any way to calculate like the carbon footprint of a site? Is there something that is like before you were talking about like the embedded carbon footprint versus the used carbon footprint? I'm assuming the embedded carbon footprint is basically all the carbon it takes me to make my site, right?
And the device, basically, and the devices that you've used to actually make the site.
So how do you like that? Sounds like a lot of math.
It's a math. I'll send you. I've done calculators on the basic. I can send it. There's a bit of math there, but it's kind of at a basic level. It's saying, oh, this laptop created 300 kg of CO2 during manufacture. I'm going to keep it for 5 years. I'm going to use it 8 hours a day. It's not that complicated to get a sense of how much per hour I would allocate of CO2. But if you want to know an actual web page, there's a really lovely tool out there called the Website Carbon Calculator, which now what it looks at is how fast the impact of the download of your page. So it doesn't measure the amount of time somebody is on the page using the page, but it looks at it's a very nice tool, and it's very well tested. It's been around quite a while. Whole Grain Digital has done it. There's another great entity in the US called Mighty Bytes, Tim Frick, that has a similar tool. I just can't remember the name of the tool just at the moment. But Website Carbon Calculator is a very good to give you a sense of where you're at in because it says, oh, you're one of the cleanest websites out there, you're one of the dirtiest websites out there, and it'll give you some ideas of where you're at but that'll just be telling you about the download impact of your site. So it's an important, but it's just a small part of the overall picture.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One of the things that I'm hearing as you're talking through this, and I'm saying this only slightly facetiously, but you said reuse of code is one of the most important things. So what you're saying is open source is green.
It is.
Things like Drupal, WordPress, all these open source projects.
I was thinking the same. Yeah.
It is, and it is because you create something new. So there's 4 components of impact of data. if we say everything is data, right? There's 4 CO2 impacts. There's the create environment, right? There's the transfer environment, there's the use environment, and there's the store environment. So there's 4 areas where data can create CO2. So in my analysis, the 2 areas where the vast majority of the damage occurs is either in the creation or the use. The actual transfer it impacts, but it's, generally networks are quite efficient at transfer. So transfer is not a big part of the story. It's maybe 1% in 100%. Store is maybe another percent at the process. So the create space, because for you to create a website is 200 hours or 300 hours to create an app, create a feature in an app could be 600 hours of work or so, that. So there's potential. So for Netflix, it's streaming, blah blah blah, etc. Yeah, but how much did the show cost?
Right.
To make that show, that could have cost millions of dollars in the pro. Now that will be, if that's a bum show and nobody looks at it, then the vast majority of the impact was in the creation of it. But if that
Right.
million people look at that show, then the create will be dwarfed by the amount of energy with the 80-inch screens that are looking at it, 20 or 30 times. So most of the impact that we can have a big say about is in the create and the use. And sometimes the more time you spend creating, the less time people have to spend using. So sometimes it's better, like they often say in 1,000 words of content, if you work really hard, you'll bring it down to 500. So it takes 4 minutes to read 1,000 words. It takes 2 minutes to read 500. So you've halved the amount of time. So sometimes by spending more time in the create, you actually end up with your users having to spend less time. And those are trade-offs you need to think about.
It's
Yeah, I have a
interesting. It's interesting because it makes me think of like the rise in popularity of component libraries and design systems where a lot of things are being reused. And like, everybody, on the front end, everybody says it's always because, oh, well, it's faster time to market, right? But I mean, this is another selling point of like, hey, if we reuse this code or build this site from a component library, like we're essentially reducing the carbon footprint, right?
And you could say, John, you could have calculations and say hey, you've just saved 40 kg, because to build that component would an average of taking 200, build it and test it, etc. So you could put that would make it even nice. Make people feel better about the and if you say 40 kg, that's to say you've planted 4 trees, because basically a typical tree can sequester about 10 kg of CO2 a year. So if you've saved 40 kg, you've saved 4 trees, or 4 trees don't have to work, to deal with that carbon. So there are models of encouraging this great behavior, because reuse is a good behavior. It's a really, it's a circular economy behavior. It's a sustainable behavior, and absolutely open source is a wonderful, wonderful philosophy.
Interesting. Mike, you had something to add?
Yeah, so like when you were talking about talking about trade-offs, earlier in the episode, you were mentioning like, making your website work for devices from a long time ago, right? But a lot of the optimizations for new devices do involve like technologies that reduce data usage, that reduce, could potentially reduce the carbon impact. Some of the things I'm thinking is like newer image formats. There are newer image formats that are supported by modern browsers that use like half the data, and that decode really easily, so the computer doesn't have to work so hard to like display them and stuff. Um, versus like if we were supporting older browsers, you could use those new image formats. And I know that like there's probably not an answer quite right for that, but it is kind of a trade-off.
It is a trade-off, but at least, and you're absolutely right, Mike, but at least you have those conversations and
Yeah.
say, okay, so we will this will result in, X impact on older devices. Is it worth it? And in certain areas, like WebP or whatever, the saving is so huge. Now, of course, the other area could be you're clever and you serve and you store the older images as well, so that they're served to the older device. But at least you're thinking about these things, and they're part of the development process. Because not just older devices, but essentially. Newness is a tax on the poor, because often the poor people, often a smartphone or something like that is their primary device. It's the only way, and and these people, this is how they get their job rotas, etc. So a lot of people, it's their old device. If they don't have that device working well, they can't work in the process. And if you're like I saw a thing developed for when the Syrian refugees came into Europe initially after the initial war really blew up, and the European Union or some agency developed this thing where they could find shelter, stuff like that, but they did it in a type of JavaScript that was unusable by the vast majority of had very basic phones. So it's not just the environment, being conscious of old devices is a fairer society as well in the process, because we just are lucky that we don't have as many of those pressures, that we really worry about our phone breaking and trying to keep it alive and the battery. So anything that can be less stressful on the battery, because and that's generally, as you said, Mike, best practice. So the less energy intense it is, the less it'll keep anything that reduces stress on a device is good, is good for people, good for poor people, good for the environment. Means if we could stretch even a year or two onto our devices, that would have a big impact on the overall carbon footprint, because so much of it occurs during the manufacturing process.
That makes sense.
Interesting. So one of the things that I've been curious about as we've been having this discussion is a lot of the development that I do now is in the cloud, right? A lot of services have moved to the cloud, the nebulous cloud. I'm curious if there's been any research or thought about the impact of a cloud environment for services versus, dedicated hosting. In a dedicated data center. Is that something that has a appreciable difference?
It's a complicated thing. Generally speaking, the cloud is more efficient because much better optimization, etc., in the environment. However, your hard disk is 3,000 times more efficient than the cloud, because as a general rule, and it's not always true, but the shorter the distance data has to travel, the better, and the less over the networks. So the less data gets to the network, the better. And I know that's almost impossible in collaborative working environments, but basically in my environment, I'm not so much a developer, more content or writer stuff. I only keep 5% of my stuff in the cloud. I keep 95% of my stuff on my hard drive, because a hard drive is much more energy efficient than a cloud is, for a whole range of different reasons. So the less you can have it swinging around the network, because it's not just one copy, it's multiple copies. It's all that's all eating up little components of data. And yes, the cloud will say, yeah, but it's still more efficient than if you were doing that in a server network in your own company. Yeah, but a server network on your own company would be horrible from an energy efficiency point of view, and etc. So the cloud is more energy efficient, but the closer you can keep data, and the bigger question as well is storing and getting rid of. And we in 2020 we took 1.4 trillion photos, right? Because of the cloud, right? And that's partly because we took more photos in 2020 than in the entire 20th century. So psychologically, what the cloud does is it makes us very lazy, and it makes us store far more than we would store if we had more limited environments. So because of the cloud saying to us, it doesn't matter and it's easy to store it, we store huge, massive quantities of data, most of which is is basically poor quality or crap. Only 5% of data is actively managed.
My
So
photos are good.
Hmm?
I'm just saying my photos are good. I'm just kidding.
It's got hard drives in its basement.
Yeah. No, it was just a bad joke.
That's perfect. We're full of bad jokes here.
So hey, I got a question for you. You're talking about keeping your data close to the user. So is that an endorsement of content delivery networks? Like if you're familiar with what those are?
Yeah, where if you've got a lot of people in Europe, you get see there's perform this. It's an interesting question because there's people say, oh, isn't this sustainability thing the same as performance? And there's a lot of overlap in performance management, but it depends. See, it depends. Like there's a couple of ways of achieving performance. One is by having a very small thing to move, right, and the other is using more and more energy to move the thing. So it's like saying performance is a Ferrari. That's a performance, So, what to some degree, what we have done with these networks, etc., is that we've allowed ourselves to have bigger and bigger websites because we've created bigger engines to deliver them in the process. So we've a kind of that's performance, but it's performance at a cost that is not. You're getting fast, throttled delivered stuff because you've put a much bigger engine, distributed engine behind it, which is actually having a bigger CO2 impact, but it's hidden in the architecture. See, what the tech industry are great at doing is we hide it in the hardware, and we say, oh no, we didn't really talk about it. No, let's not talk about the hardware. Some people, there's people tell you, oh, the weight of the data doesn't matter because the way networks are designed today, they're always on. So that's which is madness, is what when you think of it. That's like having an oven that's always on, right? And you're saying, yeah, it doesn't matter if I cook 10 chickens or 2 chickens, it's still the same cost because the oven is always on. So I've designed an architecture essentially that is essentially using the same, amount of electricity, whether you're moving 10 gigabyte through it or 200 gigabyte through it. But the architecture is extraordinarily expensive to maintain. Like 5G, for example, will require much more stations than 4G because the bandwidths are shorter and they want to transfer it faster. So oftentimes we hide the CO2 in the architecture. So the content delivery network is in one sense, it's certainly the pages arriving faster, but it's not necessarily greener.
Interesting. So shifting a little bit from the actual website and the impacts of that. I've seen some organizations that have actually, requested environmental stats or carbon offsets in their RFPs. I'm wondering if you've seen this, and if so, what are they typically looking for as far as like a response to that sort of question?
Yeah. Well, offsets is a bit like the reason the Reformation happened. Remember the Catholics were all around Europe selling indulgences. And then Martin Luther says, you shouldn't be selling indulgences. Offsets are essentially indulgences. They're saying, I'm leading a crappy life, but, I'm flying all over the place, but I'm going to give X amount of euro or X amount of dollars. And so the offsets are a very dodgy space. It's not that they're totally wrong or totally bad or whatever, but there's so much greenwashing. Like I'm dealing with um, an organization today that's creating a sustainability, an eco-friendly website logo mark or whatever, and they say they're inundated by crypto companies, telling them, wanting to get the mark, saying, "Oh, we're using renewable energy." Yeah, you're killing the planet, with your Bitcoin, but you're doing renewable energy so there's an awful lot of, unfortunately, covering up our bad behaviors by buying indulgences in the process. So the offsets are often a red flag. If you're really genuinely interested in this space, they're often a red flag for an organization that's actually not trying to change, but is rather trying to cover up some bad behavior in the process. I
So
don't
it's
know if
like,
that answers, John.
yeah. So it's basically like a cheat day on a diet. You're saying like, hey, I'm building websites, which is like, or I'm hosting websites, right? Which is like, creating carbon, and there's a carbon footprint associated with it. But on the flip side, we're planting 100 trees, for every website
Exactly.
that we build to try to offset that. So let me rephrase the question a little bit, or try to get more a little bit of a different perspective on it, right? If somebody's creating an RFP, right, and they're interested in, a vendor's environmental impact, what sorts of things should they ask or look for that are truly highlight the fact that that vendor is conscientious about reducing their carbon footprint?
Okay, so one of the things would be you design with minimum waste.
Mhm.
So one of the things that we can all get rid of if we really try is or at least most times, is waste. So if you look at a typical web page, and it might be 4 or 5 megabytes, and how much of that was really necessary to build that page,
Mhm.
and how much of it was, say, lazy developer activity, sending down 300 KB of JavaScript when you didn't even need JavaScript. Like there's an environmental footprint of programming languages. Certain programming languages, like C, is more environmentally friendly than JavaScript, because and then programming languages can get more complicated as they become more environmentally friendly, because they require more understand or deeper coding, whereas more visual languages require less coding, but they have greater impact in the back end of the actual process. So if you see that this organization designs really slim, has very good coding, isn't just blocking stuff, sending 300 KB of CSS, but is actually really cares about all the components of the actual page, and probably heading more to a crafts. So you're taking modules, but you're really crafting the environment, and you don't just. So you're looking for people who are really experienced, and it's a type you're looking for an organization, rather than a bunch of students or whatever, and they're just going to throw you a bunch of pre-packaged type of stuff. That's an organization that really cares about its code, because everything, even from the HTML, has a slight impact. So everything is carefully designed with the view to maximizing the reduction of waste, whether it's in CSS, image. If you've got an image that's 250 KB, but it could be 12, well, you can say there's 210 KB of potential waste there in the process. So I would certainly be looking at an organization that really cares about these sorts of things.
I would
Got
I,
it.
w- I would say though that's a little weird though, because it's almost kind of relies on like my role, front end developer, to do that, and all this type of stuff that you're talking about is stuff that I care about and stuff that I do. But that being said, like let's say you have an organization that does care, that does try to reduce travel, that cares, but they have maybe a junior front end developer, and junior front end developer knows React, and junior front end developer was taught in a school to ship an 800 kilobyte React bundle down, just because he or she doesn't know any better. like the organization as a whole might be doing great with like lack of travel and stuff. Is there a way to like kind of ascertain the carbon footprint and like if they're doing anything to do about that? Is there any like standard report or anything like that?
Well, if you might, you would look, as I said earlier, the website Carbon Calculator will give you some ideas there. The what you call Lighthouse, and the basic tool. But if you're looking for, you're a CO2 detective, and you're looking for waste. So you're looking for saying, hey, I need to talk to that junior developer. You shipped down 800. You didn't have to. You could have done it this. You'd be looking to advise them in the sense of, hey, you got a 10 megabyte page, and it really only needs to be a megabyte, in the process. And then the UX is because the biggest space is actually in the use potentially. So let's say it takes 4 seconds for that page to download, but actually let's say it's a government form, right? So I did what I don't, you probably never heard of it, but what I've spent most of my career doing is a thing called top tasks, which is kind of a way of identifying what really matters and what doesn't matter. It's a research-based method. So I've worked with a lot of companies to kind of simplify their overall information environment. So worked a lot with Cisco over the years. And there was one form I remember where there was 20 questions, and we went to 10 questions. And one of the impacts was we went from 700 support requests a quarter to 300 on that form because people were confused by the questions, etc. It was a mess. So if you simplify a process, so let's say you've measured the first 5 seconds in the download, that's the weight of the page. But the bigger impact is the citizen has to spend 5 minutes going through the form. And you're saying, hey, you don't need to ask all these questions. If you reduce it to this, that'll take a minute off it. There's 200,000 people using it every month. You could calculate then you'd save X amount of CO2 in the process. So that would be another part of the argument of why you should simplify in the process. So you would be looking technically for part of the gain, but the biggest area, if you're a big government website, is actually in the use of the environment and how it makes it harder to use that environment. And making it simpler to use will be good in many ways, but it'll also be good for the environment.
Are companies and vendors like putting their carbon footprint data and the methods in which they're working to reduce it in like their annual reports and things like that?
Beginning, John, I think most of the people probably listening to this are probably going to be saying, I never even thought about it. I mean, that because, up until about 3 or 4 years ago, I've been working on websites since 1994, 95 in the process. And like, I thought I had it sussed or I had it fit. And then I discovered this about 3 or 4 years ago. And when I give talks, and most people are going, wow, I never even thought machines had machines have a CO2 impact. And so an awful lot of organizations are only beginning to become aware of these issues. So it's very, very rare do I see it, but it is beginning to emerge. There is a green web, a green software foundation. There are movements, but they're very nascent.
So I'm curious about shifting gears again a bit. I'm curious about another thing that I've read some articles and reports on this related to like recycling. I think in the 70s and 80s when they really started the recycle, reuse, reduce, reuse kind of slogan. And there's some articles talking about how a lot of that campaign was by companies to kind of shift the blame to the consumer, right? Where something like 90, greater than 90% of most environmental waste happens by commercial use rather than by consumer. And I imagine that there's a similar weight here, and I'm curious about what that breakdown is. Like, how much of this carbon footprint of websites is taken up by, and I just want to clarify, this isn't a statement that, okay, just because they are the largest ones, we shouldn't also reduce, we shouldn't think about this on our own projects. But I'm curious, when you look at like FANG, how much of the internet machine carbon
Yeah,
footprint is taken up by those companies and other companies
yeah.
versus consumer sites and things like that.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think you're 100% right, and you're 100% right in the 70s. And as I was saying earlier, most plastic isn't even recyclable. It was a con job to begin. So most plastic was taken back and dumped. It was never recycled. We just, so there was that whole deliberate campaign to kind of put the moral responsibility on the consumer rather than on the producer. So yeah, and I'm not trying to say that. So, but I know you've exactly said. Having said that, I'm still going to try and reduce the environment. I don't know if you're aware of the right to repair movement.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think that the only real change, the only real substantial change, is going to happen from a societal push. So it's not us as individuals saying, I'm going to now develop websites better, but it's the Drupal community, or so, going back and saying, we're not going to buy computer, like we're going back and putting pressure on organizations. But when the organizations hear that, like Apple has now become part of the right to repair, not fully, but they were dragged kicking and screaming to the table. So it was citizen action in the right to repair. Small group of people that grew and grew. Now it's becoming EU legislation. That I think that the way we are going to save this planet, if we're going to save it, is actually through citizen action. Now I know that sounds smarmy and stupid and ridiculous, but I actually believe that it's us by concerted effort coming together and saying, hey, we're not going to buy laptops anymore that have more than 150 kg of, or we're only going to buy laptops that are repairable. There are laptops coming out. Framework computer is an excellent modular computer. Fairphone is an excellent modular phone. You can change the screen, you can change easily the battery in the process. So I think we have to. The companies won't change. The big brands won't change because they're making too much money out of the planned obsolescence economy. Because there's a whole business model behind waste. Waste is a business. And what I think us coming together, whether it's Drupal communities or whether it's repair cafes in your local community, and then putting pressure on our own, we are and our own, but working together. I'm hopeful that we can drive the change, because politically they're waiting for the people. Actually, I've known a lot of politics because I've met quite a few senior people over the years, and things. And most politicians are watching the people to see, they don't care about this. They're not leaders. Most politicians are actually not leaders. They're always watching what's happening. What are people saying? Do they really care about this? So I think we have got to show we care. So if you really care about this, is it, John and Mike? It's not enough for you you got to go and talk to your brother, talk to your cousin, and see, because if we don't get together around this, the way we're moving is not in a good way, in the next 30 or 40 years. And I never imagined that I would be a doomsayer. I used to laugh at these, the end of the world is nigh. What's totally ridiculous people. So I find myself being a bit ridiculous saying that. But when I look at and I'm reading the science all the time, it's not sustainable. Mount Everest has a mass of 150 billion tons. And by 2050, we will be extracting from the planet 170 billion tons of material every year.
Wow. So, Jerry, this has been enlightening, to say the least. I think you've given us all some great stuff to think about here. I think our last question here is to what can we all do to improve the overall web's environmental impact? I mean, I think you've given us some great ideas already. But I'm just wondering if you have any other great ideas or any other thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners.
Well, I think, John, maybe it's a summary. Design light. Design out waste. So it's not net zero, it's waste zero. So wherever there's waste, it's not good in the environment. So if you can remove waste in your design process, it's a really good thing. And if you can reuse, you know, uh, and encourage reuse in the process. And remember that in the design, particularly if you've got a small hobby website, it's not so much because you don't have very many visitors. But if you've got a big government website, big commercial website, most of the impact is in your user's device, in your user's environment. So that's where user experience and design, because most of the journey, like if I'm coming to a website dealing with a government entity, 5 seconds is downloading the page, but there could be 2 minutes, 3 minutes using the page. And if the search is crappy and I don't get good search results, I've lost 20 or 30 seconds, etc. So actually, good usability is really good for the environment. The proviso is obviously you're not trying to force people to buy something really quickly. Like there's making people think can be a good thing in certain slowing them down a bit. But if they're trying to do something, generally speaking, the faster you're able and the lighter you're able to make them do that thing, the better it is for everybody in the process. And maybe finally, think about those devices. Hold on. The biggest single thing you can do is hold on to your device a year longer than you had intended to. And the next time you're going to buy one, buy a refurbished, or at least buy one that's modular, that is actually repairable. And if enough of us start asking Apple and Dell's, etc., that we want repairable devices, they're going to start listening.
Yeah. Well, Jerry, thank you for joining us. As John said, this has been an extremely enlightening show. There's a lot to think about. Like I said, you at the beginning of the show, if you had asked me what's the environmental impact of a website, you'd think, well, it's just the electricity that's used on the servers. Not even thinking about users' devices or the manufacturing process of my computer or the CI computers, like all the stuff that goes into it. I mean, it's a significantly larger impact, which on the flip side means that being more efficient, like you said, being more careful, being more thoughtful about it, there's a lot more gains to be had as well than you might think too. So, yeah, thank you for joining us. Like I said, this has been really interesting. A lot of information to unpack. Thank you for joining us.
And it's great. And thank you for inviting me. And as we said earlier, open source is the original digital sustainability.
Do you have questions, feedback, or guest ideas? Today's topic and today's guest was a suggestion from Abby. You can reach out to us at Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via an email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, Chad's Book Corner, you can sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And you can promote your Drupal community events on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing that button in the sidebar that says Become a Patron.
And Jerry, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, ask questions, what would be the best way to do that?
They'll find me, Nick, jerrymcgovern.com or on Twitter, just Jerry McGovern. And if they want to email, it's just jerry@jerrymcgovern.com with a G. It's an Irish Jerry.
And Mike, if our listeners want to get in touch with you.
You can email me at mike@herschel.com. That's HERCHEL. Or you can find me on Twitter at Mike Herschel. That's Mike Herschel. Yeah.
And John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
You can find me pretty much everywhere online at Nixvan, Nicxvan.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
See you guys next week.
Have a
Thank
good
you,
one,
Jared.
everyone.